Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's session, co-hosted by Format Approved and eGestalt Technologies. We're still waiting for some folks to join us, and while we do that, we thought it would be useful to ask some polling questions of our audience, which is kind of a fun way to get started. So if you are with us already, you should see a poll question launch here in just a moment. And please take a moment to answer the polling question. We'll get a better sense of who's with us and what the state of their compliance is. So please take a moment to answer that polling question if you could. The title of today's presentation is HIPAA Omnibus and Meaningful Use, How to Assess and Maintain Compliance. I think we're going to have a lively and informative session. So we're certainly glad to see all of you joining us. And we're going to have an interesting discussion about the changes brought by the HIPAA Omnibus rule, the requirements of meaningful use, and what you can do to be compliant. All right, it looks like most of you have voted on this first question, so I'm going to go ahead. Last few seconds here to vote if you haven't already. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and show the polling results here. So you can see that we've got a mix of actually quite a few covered entities, some business associates, and then some other folks who may not actually be covered by HIPAA directly, but obviously would like to learn more about the program. Let's do one more polling question before we begin our presentation proper. And this is for the business associates that are with us today. If you are a business associate, please tell us a little bit about your role, whether you're a VAR or an MSP, whether you may be a security service provider, or whether you're that mysterious other category. Once again, for those of you who are joining us just a little bit late, we're starting with some polling questions for fun. We're going to do a couple now and then ask a couple more later on, but we're going to begin the presentation proper here in just a moment. All right, well, I think we've got a lot of people voting. I'll give you just another 10 seconds to vote if you haven't already. Of course, some of you are not business associates, so it's not really applicable to you, but we certainly have questions coming up for our covered entities as well. All right, let's take a look and see what the results are here. Okay, you can see that other is our largest category. So, of course, business associate, these days, so many different people are business associates. But obviously, we have members of the IT community with us and a lot of covered entities as well. But let's go ahead and get to the presentation proper. As I said before, the presentation today is HIPAA Omnibus and Meaningful Use, How to Assess and Maintain Compliance. Today's session is co-hosted by eGestalt and Format Approved, so thank you for joining us. Today's industry experts are myself and Anupam Sahai. Anupam is a co-founder and the president of eGestalt Technologies. He's a recognized expert in the areas of healthcare IT, cloud computing, security, and compliance, and networking. So Anupam, it's always a pleasure to have these sessions.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Brian.
And my name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education for Format Approved. I've got extensive experience in healthcare compliance. Training is my specialty, so we're going to talk a little bit about HIPAA training requirements later, although the bulk of this presentation will be handled by Anupam. So it's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you about HIPAA compliance. All right, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to Anupam now to handle the overview. Just a few quick notes before we continue. You can ask questions of us at any time during today's session by entering them into the chat area. At the end of our session, we'll address as many questions as time allows. And one last note there. If you are a registered attendee of today's session, you'll receive an email with links to both the slides and the recorded version of this event. So with that, I'll hand it off to Anupam, and go ahead and take it, Anupam.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. So we have a packed session today. what we will cover, we will focus on HIPAA Omnibus changes. We'll talk about some of the changes that have been brought about by the regulation that was enacted in January of 2013 and was enforced starting September 2013. We will talk about how does HIPAA Omnibus affect the medical providers, business associates, and any subcontractors and vendors working in the medical community. We will also talk about the meaningful use analysis needs to get the federal grant dollars and what are the steps required to achieve the risk analysis aspect of the meaningful use analysis, because that is a very misunderstood subject. So hopefully we can demystify that today. And then we'll talk about what are the best practices and caveats for doing the HIPAA assessments, the meaningful use, and how you can not only assess it to get to a compliant state, but we will also talk about some of the best practices that you need to follow to maintain it as things change. And then we will talk about automated tools that you can leverage to assess and maintain your HIPAA compliance status and also your meaningful use status. And then we will talk about some of the training and recommended courses that are relevant for HIPAA gap analysis and meaningful use, because as you go through the process, it's important to have and acquire the domain expertise through these training courses. And at the end, we will have Q&A that allows you to ask any questions. By the way, as Brian said, as we are going through the presentation, please type in your question in the question section of the GoToWebinar. We will take the questions at the end of the session, and if we don't have the time, we will come back to you later via email and get in touch with you to answer them. So before we jump into the webinar, let's have one more question answered in terms of so this is more for covered entities. Have you done a HIPAA gap analysis today? And if so, could you please lock in your vote? This will help us understand the audience a little bit better, and we can tailor the webinar according to that. Another 5 seconds. Okay, so it looks like 50% of you have voted, and I don't see a button for show results, but I'll read out the results here.
I believe if you just say close and share, Anupam, it'll show those polling results.
Okay, so let me do that and share. So about 58% of you have said yes, 42% have said no, and so that's roughly a 60-40 split. Okay, so that's great. So let me come back to the question, the presentation here. So before we begin, I want to mention some standard disclaimers that while we have made every attempt to ensure that the information is accurate and up to date, HIPAA Omnibus is a changing topic, evolving topic, and the information here could be subject to change. If you please don't use it for any legal purposes. This is meant for your information only. Okay, so let's jump right into the webinar. Before we begin, let me just start out by talking about PHI, which is really the core of what HIPAA Omnibus is trying to protect. And PHI, or PII as it is called, personal information, is really about health information and personal information. That is really the focus of the HIPAA Omnibus regulation. And everything and anything that is mentioned in the HIPAA Omnibus regulation is really about protecting and ensuring privacy and security of PHI. And PHI can be in electronic format or it can be in physical format. PHI is related to the health information. As I said of an individual, of a patient. It can relate to any personal information such as name, address, birth date, social security number, or even genetic information. So all of that is protected. All of that is private information that needs to be secured by HIPAA Omnibus through the processes and procedures mentioned in HIPAA Omnibus. So here is one slide that describes in one slide the major changes that have been brought about by the HIPAA Omnibus rule. So let's go through it one by one. So the first thing that has been really the big game changer is that not only the covered entities, but also business associates and subcontractors and vendors working with the medical community is now responsible and liable, and they're required by law to be compliant with HIPAA Omnibus. And there are a number of changes that have been brought about around how the information, which is part of PHI, can be used, can be shared, and who gets the rights to review it and access it. So there are lots of new processes and procedures in place to limit the use and sharing of information. And the center in all of this is the patient, the individual whose information is being accessed or shared. So the individual has complete right to access the PHI information. He or she has complete authority to view who is sharing the information, who's accessing the information, and they have the right to deny it if they don't deem that to be necessary. So the individual is the center of the universe in terms of how the information is shared and accessed. It also brings about a number of changes in terms of how the individuals get involved in the process. So NPP, Notice of Privacy Practices, is a key document, key policy document that essentially enables the individual to authorize what information gets shared and who gets to see it. As a part of the BA being responsible, there is a new version of the BA agreement, Business Associate Agreement, that needs to be put in place along with new policies and other documentation as a result of the new HIPAA Omnibus law. So you can see that there are a number of new policy documents, new agreements and contracts that have been put in place. And if there is a breach, if there is a willful neglect that has been brought to the notice of HHS, the Health and Human Services, which is the main entity that's responsible for enacting the HIPAA law, if they come to know about what is called a willful neglect, and willful neglect is if covered entities and BAs are aware that they need to be HIPAA compliant and they don't take steps towards meeting the HIPAA Omnibus requirements, they are deemed to be under willful neglect. So if a willful neglect case comes up and is reported to HHS, then HHS is required to investigate the matter, the incident. And so businesses are open to being investigated by HHS and the state auditor generals, which are authorized now by HHS to enforce the law. And there are more penalties, increased penalties compared to prior to HIPAA Omnibus. The maximum fine was up to $50,000. Now the civil penalties have gone up. It's up to a maximum of $1.5 million per incident. And there are potential criminal prosecution abilities that the enforcing agencies have. So clearly the penalties, both civil and criminal, have gone up to a large extent. And the other key change is that if a breach does happen for whatever reason, then it's a mandate that both the business associates and the covered entities, they need to report the breach to the government, to HHS, if the number of medical records involved is more than 500. So as I said, these are the top high-level game changers or major changes that have come about in HIPAA Omnibus, and we'll cover some of the details as we move forward. So what does it mean if you're a covered entity, a business associate, or a vendor in the medical community? How does this all impact you? So there are major implications. So one of the key implications is that now covered entities and the BAs and the subcontractors have a shared responsibility and shared liability to ensure that not only they themselves are being compliant, but any other vendor or BA that they work with are also compliant. And it's a shared responsibility and shared liability. So you need to take proactive steps to ensure that everybody that you're working with and who's involved in PHI information sharing, access, and transmission is compliant. The other implication is that both, as I said earlier, the HHS and the state auditor generals can now bring civil actions against businesses that are required to be HIPAA Omnibus compliant, and they include covered entities, business associates, and subcontractors. Once investigated and found to be in violation, the fines can be up to $1.5 million per incident with no upper limit. And there are potential criminal prosecution possible as a result of violations. And the proceeds of the fines that are found are shared between the enforcement agency. It could be the OCR, Office of Civil Rights, which is the enforcement agency of HHS. It can be shared with the state auditor generals and potentially by the whistleblower who's informing the government. So there are some mechanisms built into it to ensure that enforcement happens and enforcement is taking place for all the businesses that are required to be compliant. And so this means that there's a liability chain that extends from covered entities to business associates to subcontractors and vendors that are part of the whole PHI information sharing process. And so this has also implications in terms of what a covered entity or a BA or a vendor needs to do once a breach happens. They need to put together some breach notification mechanisms in place to ensure that they are reporting the incident to the right agency. So the scope of BAs is fairly broad. As I said earlier, a business associate who now is required by law to be HIPAA compliant is anybody and everybody who's involved in PHI access, sharing, or storage. So you could be a lawyer, you could be an accountant, you could be a service provider, you could be a managed service provider or a reseller or an electronic medical record provider. Anybody and everybody who's working with the medical community and is involved in accessing the PHI information is required by law to be HIPAA Omnibus compliant. And so suddenly, not only just the 700,000 covered entities who are earlier required to be compliant, now there are about 1.2 million plus business associates that are part of this, within the scope of being required by law to be compliant with HIPAA. So let's change gears a little bit and talk about risk analysis. Why is there a need to conduct risk analysis? And risk analysis is an integral part of meaningful use attestation. So we will talk about risk analysis and then meaningful use analysis soon thereafter. So the big reason to do a risk analysis is that you are security hardening your infrastructure. And you want to prevent security breaches. You want to measure where you stand as an organization with respect to risk exposure and how easily can an external cyber attacker or possibly an insider, a malicious insider, can access the information that they are not entitled to. So if you get breached for whatever reason, studies have shown that the average cost of dealing with a breach, which includes brand damage and potential lawsuits, etc., is about 5.5 million. And it literally takes weeks and months before you can figure out that you've been breached. And so it's a very damaging and a painful process. Also, regulations like HIPAA High-Tech mandate that you do a security risk analysis so that you are ensuring the privacy and security of the PHI information that I talked about. And if you want to apply for the meaningful use EHR incentive dollars from the federal government, then this is part of the requirement. Other regulations also have this similar requirement where you are required to do risk analysis. And as I said earlier, that risk analysis is an executive measure at some level to justify the budgets for both compliance and security efforts that happen in the company. And it gives them a good measure, good quantified measure of how risk exposed is the company and what steps need to be taken to plug the gaps that are found. So from a meaningful use assessment point of view for HIPAA Omnibus, the process is simple, that you need to do a risk analysis that involves all the PHI assets. And when I say PHI assets, I mean all the assets such as servers, it could be desktops, it could be firewalls, all the assets that are involved in PHI access, storage, or transmission need to be included in the analysis. And once you do that, you need to understand how vulnerable are these assets. And vulnerability here could be because the assets are not patched properly, the software updates are not put in place, and because the vulnerabilities are there, it can be compromised by threats, which could be due to external hackers or malicious insiders. And so to assess the threats and vulnerabilities, it's important to understand where does the current asset status lie. And once you have a picture of that for all the PHI assets, the next step is to figure out what kind of security controls are in place and how likely is it that a hacker or a malicious insider can compromise or steal the data. And so you go through a set of steps to understand and value that those different questions, and you come up with a risk score that tells you the risk exposure or the likelihood of likelihood of a break-in happening, and the risk score will tell you how critical the risk exposure is. So the purpose of doing a risk analysis, as I said earlier, is that if you as a covered entity or a business associate, you are handling PHI information, you want to make sure that your systems are up to date and are secured and are not prone to be broken in or to be compromised, so that all the PHI information is not stolen away. So let me pause here and ask you a related question here, which is that how many of you have either asked for meaningful use grant dollars or will be asking for it today? And this is, of course, valid for meaningful use, so covered entities only. Okay, so looks like about another 10 seconds or so. Okay. So another 2 seconds. Okay, so I'm going to close the polling now and show the results. So about 60% of you have said yes, that you have done and completed a meaningful use attestation to secure the grant. About 30% of you have said no. That's pretty good. And I guess a related question is how many of you will be doing risk analysis, because risk analysis needs to be done and repeated every year. So will you continue to do risk analysis going forward? Is that something as part of your plan today, or you would be planning for it? Okay. So I'll give you another 10 seconds to answer that question. Two seconds. Okay, very good. So the results tell us that about 80% of you have shown interest in doing a security risk analysis, 20% no. I wonder whether the 20% folks are already have a set of processes to ensure that they are not being compromised. So that will be interesting to understand. Okay. So let me move forward. So let's change gears. Given the background about meaningful use and the security risk analysis, let's now talk about what can businesses do to prepare themselves to deal with an auditor. It could be an auditor from an OCR, and as you would know, that the Office of Civil Rights, which is the enforcement agency from HHS, is planning to launch a full-blown audit program in 2014. They did a pilot program in 2012, which involved 150 odd businesses, and this year it's going to be a bigger formal program. So the question is, what is the OCR looking for when they do an audit? And OCR essentially is looking for to ensure that all the businesses, whether it's covered entity or business associates, they are meeting the HIPAA Omnibus requirements. And meeting the HIPAA Omnibus requirements means they have the privacy rule implementation in place, which has a number of policy documents. It has a number of guidelines in terms of how the PHI information is shared, it's used and disclosed, and that the individual essentially is involved in ensuring the privacy of the information. The second big check mark from an OCR perspective is that the PHI information that's made available and shared with the medical business is being secured properly, and that means that there are processes and physical safeguards in place along with technical mechanisms such as encryption, such as secure transmission of data, so that all these requirements are put in place to ensure the security of the PHI information. And they also look at the breach notification rule and the risk analysis. In fact, one of the key findings from the 2012 audit report that was published was that a lot of the businesses were not doing risk analysis, and that's a big red flag. So given what OCR is looking for from businesses from a audit perspective, what can businesses do to prepare themselves for an OCR audit? So let me talk about 7 steps here. First thing is to clearly understand the HIPAA Omnibus requirements, which is what I covered earlier, and to understand the scope of implementation, who's affected, and what does it mean to implement HIPAA Omnibus. And you'll see that really HIPAA Omnibus is about best practices from the security industry to protect PHI. So there needs to be a security and compliance plan put in place by the organization. And depending on the size of the business, the plan could involve 1 or 2 persons. For larger organizations, if you have multiple locations, the plan could be a lot more comprehensive. And the plan includes communicating and training employees, assigning roles and responsibility, along with accountability to ensure that they understand what needs to be done, and this is enforced and checked regularly. And of course, along with accountability comes disciplinary policies and procedures to ensure that they're not shifting blame. The next step then is to do the baselining, which is to do a self-assessment and gap analysis to figure out how far apart is the business today vis-a-vis the HIPAA Omnibus requirements, and that is done by doing self-assessment and doing vulnerability scanning for all the PHI assets that I talked about, and this is part of security and risk analysis, where you ultimately come up with a risk exposure score that tells you how far apart are you from a gap perspective, and the risk analysis will tell you what are the relative prioritizations of the gaps that are found. And once you understand the gaps and the relative prioritization, the next step is to put together safeguards and controls to fix the problems that are found, put together a breach notification plan if you don't have it. And once you've done that, once you've fixed all the gaps and remediation, then you can generate what is called a proof of compliance or an attestation of compliance that shows the steps that you've taken towards meeting the HIPAA Omnibus requirements. And of course, this needs to be repeated to ensure that you are continuously in compliance. So as I said earlier, that you need to repeat the HIPAA Omnibus compliance steps, and it's not only important that you assess it one time where you stand and fix the problems, but you need to continuously monitor to ensure that you are safeguarding the information in an ongoing fashion. So there is a need for continuous monitoring of your compliance status, of your security status, and this is because things change, and things change. The changes could be because you have new employees, because there are new policies that are being put in place, new assets being added to the infrastructure, or it could simply be because new threats and vulnerabilities appear and emerge pretty much on a daily basis. NIST maintains a database of new vulnerabilities that are changing by the day. And so you want to make sure that as things change internally or externally, your compliance posture, your security posture, and risk exposure is measured and is maintained so that you are up to the challenge to deal with any potential violations that could happen otherwise.
Anupam, would you mind? I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you mind if I jump in for just a second?
Please go ahead.
I'd just like to add in here, part of why this is so important is I think a lot of the time people are focused on audits from OCR, and those are certainly something to worry about. But I think the much bigger worry that whether you're a business associate or a covered entity that you really need to think about is the possibility of a breach. And, you know, a breach can be inadvertent. It can be that a mobile device is stolen. It can be that a firewall isn't properly secured. It can also be from a malicious attack, and we've seen lots of evidence in recent months and the last couple of years of a real uptick in malicious activity against people around health records. I think the statistics I saw the other day were that there's been a 100% rise in the number of malware attacks against people who house PHI. So if you're looking at why continuous monitoring is important, I think that's a huge part of it. You may be able to check a box and satisfy an audit if you do a risk analysis once a year, but if you really want to protect yourself against a breach, just checking that box, that's not enough. You really need to be protected against breaches, and continuous monitoring is the best way to do that. Just wanted to throw that out there for you, Anupam.
Thank you, Brian. That's a great point, that preventing security breaches is key to managing your risk exposure, and not to mention the cost of dealing with a breach is, as I mentioned earlier, about $6.5 million per incident. And that can be pretty expensive and can have huge ramifications for businesses to deal with that cost. So how can you maintain your compliance and security status? So you need to repeat your risk analysis. You need to continuously monitor your security and compliance status. And you need to make sure that your policies, procedures, and training is up to date. And as new threats emerge, as new vulnerabilities emerge, you need to make sure that that's being tracked and monitored so that you're able to maintain your security and compliance posture. And that's key to avoiding any breaches, to preventing any breaches, but also to pass any audits that might happen, because you need to ensure that these steps required towards compliance in terms of assessment and maintaining it is done on a regular basis. So given that background, let's change gears a little bit and talk about automation and what can, and the good news is that there are a number of automation tools that are out there, and we talk about Agify, which is pretty much the market leader in terms of dealing with your security monitoring and compliance management issues. And it's designed from the ground up to be for the HIPAA regulation, and it supports a subscription-based model which allows you to take care of not only HIPAA high-tech regulation issues, but if you take credit cards, then you might also want to think about PCI and other regulations that concern you can be supported by the tool. It also has built-in security scanning capability that will do vulnerability analysis, and both for compliance and the security posture management, it will tell you not only the gaps that are found, but also the remediation steps needed to fix the problems. And you can look into any assets that are inside the organization, or if you have assets that are sitting on the internet, facing the internet, or outside the company, you can deal with those assets as well. It will also do risk analysis, risk management, and you'll get a risk score. And from a domain expertise point of view, it doesn't require you to be a HIPAA expert. There is a knowledge base in the tool that has built-in policies, contracts, and best practices that will enable you to understand the requirements in a very simple, easy to understand language. And there are templates available that you can customize to meet your HIPAA Omnibus requirements and also your security and risk requirements. So it's, again, completely cloud-based subscription model and completely software-based approach. You don't need to install any hardware, and it takes care of all the training and certification needs as well. There's integration with ForMed, and all the courses that they offer is part of the solution that's built into the tool. So what can you do with the tool? You can essentially manage your entire security and compliance posture using the tool. And if there are channel service providers or resellers who are interested in offering this as a managed service, you can do that using the platform. And one way or the other, you will have complete real-time view of your security and compliance posture. You will also understand your risk exposure, and you can generate a report that is required for meaningful use that can be submitted to the federal government for getting the federal grant dollars. And you can do this remotely. You don't need to be on the customer premise, or if you're managing a different location within your business, you are able to do this remotely using the tool. So it's a complete automation tool with very minimal deployment footprint. And the tool allows you to not only manage covered entities internally, but if you're working with any business associate or vendors and subcontractors, you can manage their security and compliance posture as well. And then depending on the business size, you can pick and choose the right edition that works for you. You have multiple options there that you can pick and choose from. I don't want to spend too much time here, but I just want to flash this workflow that is supported by the tool. And this goes back to what I mentioned that businesses need to do towards assessing and maintaining their HIPAA Omnibus compliance status to do risk analysis. And typically the steps that you follow when you are being HIPAA compliant and you're trying to assess and maintain it, the first step is that you want to do a baseline assessment to understand what the gaps are. And once you do the baseline, the next step is to fix all the gaps that are found by putting together a security strategy, putting together new policies and contracts. It might involve training employees internally, communicating all the best practices and the do's and don'ts to internal employees, etc. So all that is part of putting together a remediation plan, and the tool will work with you to guide you through the process of not only identifying what the gaps are, but also give you guidance with respect to what needs to be done and how to go about fixing the problems that are found. So it's a complete soup to nuts solution to deal with all your security and compliance problems. And from a HIPAA perspective, that's a big deal because there is a lot of confusion out there today in the marketplace around what needs to be done and what is missing. So the tool will demystify the HIPAA Omnibus problem and the HIPAA Omnibus related security and compliance issues.
And if I
then
could just...
you can use the tool to not only... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add something in there, too. Another thing on the meaningful use perspective is that people often think that they just need to do a risk analysis once, maybe once in their entire lives, and then go on their merry way, and that then they can attest for meaningful use. But then even if they're doing it at least every year, a lot of people don't seem to understand that it's a requirement that you actually remediate the vulnerabilities that are found too. So it's not enough just to do a risk analysis. You actually have to remediate that. That's the requirement to satisfactorily attest for those funds. So people need to be aware of all the requirements there on the meaningful use side of things. Sorry to interrupt. Go on, Anupam.
Not a problem, Ryan. Good point. So from a tool perspective, you have access to the dashboard with the real-time views of your security, risk, and compliance status. You can create reports that are available that will serve as proof of compliance in terms of how you're assessing it, what steps you're taking to maintain it, and you can create a report output that can be submitted to the government for the meaningful use grant dollars. I want to show you some screenshots so that you have a sense of how simple it is for you as an end customer or as a channel partner to offer this service. You know, every customer and the partner will have a complete view, real-time view of the security and compliance posture for the customer, and you'll have a top-level this is the executive summary dashboard, which tells you the security and compliance status right now, which is critical and very high, which means there are problems that need to be fixed. And if you want to play around with the tool, there's a free community edition with limited features available so that you can kick the tires and see what the tool feels like and looks like. So you can go to egestall.com and download a free subscription for the community edition there. This is what the managed services dashboard looks like. So if there are resellers and channel partners who are interested in exploring this, you will essentially have access to the dashboard, and this could be an internal employee who's managing and overseeing the whole process in a business as well. So you have access to all the locations, all your customers in one screen, and then you have access to very simple tasks that you can perform remotely to manage the whole process. And from a self-assessment perspective, customers are asked very simple yes or no questions that are very easy to understand, and they can also upload evidence to justify their answers. And if they need any help with respect to guidance for best practices to help them understand the requirements, they have that very easily available to them with the click of a button. HIPAA has some very difficult to understand terms. So for example, if you see the requirement here is to maintain a working personal definition of personal data, and that it might take days to understand the scope of that. So from a solution perspective, we make it very simple for you to understand what does it mean to define personal data, and then you have access to documents that you can review and come up to speed very quickly through the knowledge base. We also have contract agreements and templates that's available in the document, in the tool, with the click of a button. So HIPAA Omnibus, for example, requires that you put together a BA agreement with all your business associates and subcontractors. And the agreement details have changed since the HIPAA Omnibus came into effect. So we have the latest updated documents in the solution for you. And then we have best practices, implementation guidelines, all the good stuff that you would need to understand where you stand and what needs to be put in place. This is the dashboard for the security scanning view. So it tells you all the vulnerabilities that you have, which assets are affected, how things are changing with time, if you've done multiple scans. And by the way, you can schedule scans weekly, monthly, quarterly, depending on how frequently things change. And you're able to subscribe to the service which takes care of that. And as I said earlier, we not only tell you all the problems that are found, but we also tell you how to fix the problem. So in this particular case, there's a vulnerability that's found on a server machine, and there are multiple links to download the patches that are available to fix the problems that are found. And then there are copious reports available. So for example, there's a report for meaningful use. This is the output that's available from the tool. You can submit it to the government to meet the requirement there. There's a report on compliance, which tells you your overall HIPAA status, compliance status, or lack thereof. There's a security report that tells you your security posture. And this is kind of looking inside the report. We tell you not only what the problems are, all the gaps that are found, all these non-compliance are gaps. And then for the non-compliant gaps, we tell you how to fix the problems that are found. So it's a complete solution which solves the entire problem and guides you through the whole process. So Brian, should I hand it over to you now?
Sure, that'd be fine if you'd like.
Okay.
Let me just
have it now.
Thank you, Anupam. Let me just pull my slides up here. All right, thank you for bearing with me as I switched over there. Just a quick note about our element here as part of the tool offered by eGestalt, and that's that Format Approved, we specialize in online training around HIPAA, health IT, meaningful use, those subjects. And so we've partnered with eGestalt because we think that their tool is the best thing out there available for helping people manage their compliance. And we have a fully automated but very rigorous online education tool that you can access directly through eGestalt. So you can see there that on your screen that in the corner of the eGestalt tool you can click on training. That'll take you right through to access our training site where you can buy whatever training you need. We have 2 levels of training. HIPAA requires workforce training for anyone who comes into contact with PHI. So whether you're a business associate or a covered entity, any of your staff members who have access to PHI must have training on an annual basis. But HIPAA also requires a higher level of training for whoever you designate as the security officer, and every organization needs to have a security officer. So we also offer a higher level of training for that security officer so that they can understand their role and their obligations. Just a little bit about ForMed training and how it works. All of our training, including the HIPAA training, is developed by leading industry experts. So we go to the top people in the fields and then work with our top editorial team to develop the highest level, the highest quality training out there. We're reviewed and approved by healthcare technology industry leaders, as I was saying, but we also have accreditation from various bodies. So if you're a nurse, you can get nursing CEUs through the ANCC. Anyone can get continuing education credits that are convertible to college credit through ISET. We have some coding courses, so a HEMA credit for coding CEUs goes to that, and we're actually this week launching CME versions for several of our courses, including the higher level HIPAA course. So just some brief notes about that. You can see that we've got our HIPAA and compliance category. We offer training on the PQRS program and meaningful use, EHR training, and ICD-10 training as well. We have the approach for our training, I think, is especially well suited to HIPAA compliance training because we use what we call the 10-10-10 method. So all of our courses involve a 10-minute text read, a 10-minute video review of the same content. So that suits those people who are, whether some people prefer to read, some people prefer to listen and or watch. So you can go at it either way. It also gives you a quick review of the content there. And then there's a quiz at the end where you just make sure that you understand the content. So for HIPAA, for example, our higher level course is 10 modules long. You run through each of these 3 for the 10 modules, and that culminates in a final exam. One of the nice features of that is that it tracks compliance module by module. We keep a record of that training compliance in perpetuity. If you're training a large group of people, you can go ahead and have a team leader in our system. All of this is online and cloud-based, so you can actually check on your own users and be sure that they're completing the lessons as required. So feel free to contact me. You'll see our contact information in a little bit if you have other questions about that. So Anupam, I think the closing remarks are yours to make. Maybe we can just stick with my screen, but go through some of the closing remarks here.
Yeah, so essentially what we want to close here today, and we'll try to take some questions here. I was trying to answer them as you were speaking. So if you have any HIPAA Omnibus related security and compliance issues, I would urge you to take a look at the Edify tool that's available for you to automate and manage your whole HIPAA Omnibus compliance process. If you're interested in getting the incentive dollars from the federal government, you can also use the tool to generate a report to do that. If you could build out the whole slide, Brian, please.
Sure. Oops.
And we, as Brian was mentioning, we have partnered with each other to provide you the access to the format training and certification courses, and the courses cover a large variety of topics. Certainly HIPAA is one of them, but there are lots of courses on security and healthcare in general that you might want to look into. And if you want to train yourselves internally or offer it to other employees or other customers, feel free to look at that. And if there are service providers who are looking at offering these services, again, you can look at the tool as a managed services platform that's available to you and your customers. So with that,
I'd just like to add in there, if you don't mind, Anupam, on the EHR and MU incentive dollars, HIPAA is a requirement whether you're in the meaningful use program or not, so everybody needs to do it. But one of the things to keep in mind is if you are attesting for meaningful use dollars, the audit program for MU is much more comprehensive and aggressive than the one for HIPAA, sad as it is to say. So their goal is to audit 10% of all attestations each reporting period. That's a huge percentage of folks who are going to get audited, and we hear from industry experts that the #1 reason why they fail those MU audits is because they either didn't do a risk analysis or they didn't do a proper risk analysis. So certainly everyone should do this, but if you're in the MU program, you really, then it's doubly on you to be sure that you're meeting your HIPAA and meaningful use obligations.
Yeah, that's a great point, because most of the audits that were done in 2012 where organization really failed or didn't measure up was because of them not doing security risk analysis. So that's a very critical part of the whole HIPAA Omnibus requirements. And just doing security risk analysis is a step, but it's not a complete step. You need to be HIPAA compliant, and then you need to do a security risk analysis. So both the steps are needed towards meeting all the requirements. So with that, I think we are running out of time here, Brian. I don't know whether you have we have time for questions, but here is the contact information for both eGestalt and Format. Feel free to reach out to us, or if you need a copy of the slides, send us an email. I believe an archived version of the webinar will be available on eGestalt and also on Format website. Is that correct, Brian?
That's correct, and so folks have already asked about this. You are going to get the slides. Don't worry about that. We'll send that out in a follow-up. And you'll also have access to a recorded version of this. So it's a lot to take in. If you need to review any of this, you'll get those materials down the road, along with written answers to the questions you've submitted. We've got some great questions from the audience. If you haven't asked your question yet, you might want to type it in real fast or contact either of us by email, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. Anupam, any other matters we need to cover? We are nearly out of time.
That's right. I think we are done for today. So I would like to thank all of you for coming today and spending the time with us. And we need your feedback in terms of whether you like the session and if you would like us to cover any other topics that might be of relevance to you. Please reach out to either Brian or me, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Have a great day today.